On a warm October night in 1968, deep inside a dim warehouse on the outskirts of Daytona, a thin man in a grease-stained fedora leaned over a small block Chevy that still ticked and crackled as it cooled. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering just enough to make the shadows dance across the concrete floor. The engine, a compact 302 cubic inch V8, sat on the dyno like a coiled predator, its headers bleeding out waves of heat. A minute earlier, it had screamed past 9,000 RPM, the sound sharp enough to make your ears ring long after the throttle snapped shut. The man was Henry "Smokey" Yunick, mechanic, engineer, rule-bender, mad scientist, and he scribbled a few crooked notes into his dog-eared pocketbook before letting out a dry, satisfied laugh. He knew what he had just done. He'd taken Chevrolet's already feisty Trans Am 302 and tuned it into something the rulebook had never intended to exist. A small block with the lungs of a much larger beast. A factory engine sharpened by a renegade's hand. But that scene wasn't just about one genius tinkering in the night. It captured the spirit of an entire American moment. Late in the 1960s, when Detroit's survival instincts were wrapped in chrome and buried under layers of corporate rivalry. The muscle car boom was reaching its peak. Ford was riding high on Mustang fever, selling a lifestyle as much as a car. Chrysler was lighting bonfires with their big block bruisers, and Chevrolet, the longtime heavyweight champion, found itself forced into a new kind of boxing match, one where finesse mattered more than fists. The battleground was the SCCA Trans Am series, the hottest marketing weapon of the decade, and in 1966, the sanctioning body laid down its most infamous rule. All entries must run engines under 305 cubic inches. It looked harmless enough, a neat way to keep things production-based, but that limit reshaped the entire industry. No more brute force big block solutions, no shortcuts. If you wanted power, you had to squeeze it out the hard way, with airflow, geometry, metallurgy, and sheer stubborn creativity. That's where the idea of a Chevrolet 302 came from. A short-stroke, high-revving anomaly built specifically so the Camaro Z/28 could punch a Mustang in the teeth where it counted most, right on the Trans Am grid. The 302 was already wild by factory standards. It barked, snarled, and lived in a RPM range most engines of the era feared to tread. But in the hands of Smokey Yunick, a man who treated rules like polite suggestions, the engine became something else entirely: sharper, louder, hungrier. In Detroit's glass towers, executives fretted over budgets. In engineering labs, men in oil-stained shirts hunted for single-digit horsepower gains. And on racetracks, drivers demanded engines that wouldn't flinch at 8,500 RPM. Out of that pressure cooker came secret versions, unofficial experiments whispered about but rarely documented, including the mythic Smokey-tuned Chevrolet 302Z28. To understand the Smokey-tuned 302, you first have to understand what the engine meant to Chevrolet engineers in the late 60s. The standard Z28 302 was already something of a mechanical misfit, the kind of engine that shouldn't exist on paper, but absolutely belonged on a race grid. Built by pairing a 327 block with a 283's short-stroke crank, it became a rev-happy, sharp-edged V8 that behaved less like a Detroit torque motor and more like a furious European race engine wearing a plaid shirt. But Smokey Yunick didn't see the 302 as a finished product. He saw it as raw ore, a compact piece of metal that could be heated, hammered, reshaped, and sharpened into a weapon. To him, every surface was negotiable, every tolerance elastic, every horsepower a question no engineer had answered boldly enough. Smokey always said he wasn't cheating. He was just playing by the rules they forgot to write. Inside Chevrolet, the 302 project touched a handful of men whose personalities were as distinct as their engineering choices. There was Vince Piggins, the fiercely competitive manager who viewed racing not as a hobby, but as a blood feud with Ford. Camaro's reputation was his personal crusade. Piggins had a sharp grin, quick temper, and a Rolodex of racers who trusted him. For him, the 302 wasn't an engine, it was a declaration. Then there were the quiet thinkers. People like Don McPherson, who obsessed over valve train harmonics and spent nights calculating how much lift the springs could tolerate before a valve would float at high RPM. And of course, there were the mechanics on the ground, the men with brass feeler gauges in their pockets, trying to turn engineering theory into something that wouldn't grenade on a driver at full throttle. But Smokey stood apart. He wasn't a Chevrolet employee. He wasn't bound by corporate politics. He hovered around their world like a force of nature, dangerous, unfiltered, and impossible to control. Chevrolet needed him, but they never fully trusted him. Smokey loved that. He thrived in the tension. When he got his hands on the 302, he approached it as a puzzle. How much air could he coax through those small block heads? How far could he push compression without turning the chambers into grenades? How much of the engine's factory identity could he reshape before SCCA inspectors raised an eyebrow? Smokey's shop was a laboratory, a church, and a battlefield. His dyno sessions often ran deep into the night, when the Florida humidity made everything sticky and the glowing headers turned the room into a furnace. Drivers who tested Smokey's 302 said the engine felt alive, impatient, at idle, eager the moment the throttle moved, screaming past 8,000 RPM like it wasn't aware it should have limits. It didn't pull like a big block. It clawed, it climbed, it demanded. And that was precisely what Smokey wanted, an engine with a personality too loud to ignore. The Smokey-tuned 302 wasn't simply a hotter version of Chevrolet's factory small block. It was a reinterpretation, a re-engineering of the entire airflow philosophy behind a Trans Am engine. Smokey started with the foundation, the 4.00-inch bore and 3.00-inch stroke that gave the 302 its signature personality. That short stroke wasn't just a spec, it was a statement. It meant high RPM, fast piston travel, and an engine that lived where most V8s wheezed. But Smokey wasn't satisfied with high. He wanted astronomical. He attacked airflow first. Smokey believed horsepower was made in the cylinder heads more than anywhere else, and the factory 302 heads, good as they were, offered too many compromises, so he reshaped the ports with almost surgical intent. He didn't just port and polish, he recontoured the runners to accelerate flow, shifting cross-sectional areas so the mixture would stay stable well above 7,500 RPM. His intake ports were known for looking oddly asymmetric, like the metal had been bent by lightning rather than tools. Smokey's logic was simple. Air doesn't care about symmetry, it cares about speed. Then came the combustion chambers. Smokey raised compression ruthlessly, often nudging 12 to 1 or slightly above, depending on fuel. He believed in small, fast-burning chambers that punished detonation through sheer efficiency rather than fear. He reshaped squish areas, tightened quench clearances, and used piston domes that looked like miniature sculptures. When mechanics pulled the heads off a Smokey-built 302, They saw geometry that didn't match any Chevrolet manual, which was exactly the point. Valve train reliability was another battleground. The 302 lived at redlines most engines of its time feared. At 8,200 to 8,600 RPM, spring harmonics became a mortal enemy. Smokey tested springs until they cracked, changed wire shapes, experimented with retainers, and even modified rocker ratios in ways he rarely admitted publicly. The goal was simple: no valve float. Not at peak RPM, not ever. Even the intake manifold became a weapon. Smokey loved to find loopholes in the rulebook, like altering runner length in ways officials couldn't easily measure, or heating the incoming mixture to increase vaporization at mid-range RPM. He'd chamfer bolt holes for airflow. He'd blueprint tolerances Chevy engineers never dreamed of. Every bolt, every stud, every gasket had a purpose. But while Smokey was reimagining the engine, Chevrolet was fighting another war, the political one. Executives demanded reliability and legality. Racers demanded power. The SCCA demanded honesty. And Smokey didn't care what anyone demanded. He cared only about winning. Every innovation he introduced came with tension. Corporate men nervous about inspections, engineers anxious about failures, racers wondering if this engine would make them heroes or leave them coasting in silence. The Smokey 302 lived on a razor's edge, mechanically brilliant, politically radioactive. The fall of the Smokey-tuned 302 didn't come with a bang. It arrived the way most legends fade, through politics, caution, and the slow, tightening hands of corporate oversight. By 1969, Chevrolet was fighting battles on too many fronts: rising insurance premiums that scared off young buyers, tightening emission standards, and an internal tug-of-war between marketing dreams and boardroom anxieties. In that world, Smokey Yunick's renegade brilliance was both an asset and a liability. The factory needed engines that stayed well within the lines. Smokey preferred engines that danced right over them. Chevrolet engineers respected him deeply. Many quietly idolized him. But upper management viewed Smokey as a walking risk. His interpretations of the rulebook made Trans Am inspectors sweat. His modifications pushed metallurgy to the brink. And his dyno numbers, well, they were far better than anything the factory could officially admit existed. By the end of the 1969 season, Chevrolet began steering towards safer, more standardized versions of the 302. Durable, predictable, and easy to clear through tech inspection. The wild ones, the smoky heads, the high compression chambers, the reworked intake tricks that shouldn't have worked but absolutely did, were never suggested, never referenced, never put into engineering memos. They were quietly swept back under the rug, tolerated only as long as they stayed unofficial. Smokey, never one to stay still, drifted toward other battles, indie projects, NASCAR feuds, black flag controversies, and a continuing Cold War with rulemakers. The Smokey 302 disappeared the way many underground developments do, half buried, half forgotten, but never fully erased. And yet the legend grew. Mechanics whispered stories late at night, claims of a Smokey-built 302 that cleared 480 horsepower on race fuel, stories about a secret set of heads that outflowed anything GM made until the mid-70s, rumors of a Daytona shop fire that destroyed irreplaceable prototypes, even tales of a surviving Smokey 302 locked away in a private shop, covered with a tarp, untouched for decades. Nobody ever had proof, but nobody ever doubted the possibility, because if any man could turn a 305 cubic inch limit into a loophole big enough to win races, it was Smokey Yunick. And it leaves us with a question hanging in the warm, gasoline-scented air of memory. What if Chevrolet had fully embraced Smokey's vision? What if the small block revolution he hinted at had been allowed to grow? What if the 302, sharpened, unleashed, legally or not, had carried into the 1970s? We'll never know. But the myth of that engine and the man who shaped it still pulses in the hearts of anyone who remembers when Trans Am Thunder shook the stands. And now, if this story brought back memories of the golden age of American V8s, I invite you to join in. Leave a comment, share your own experiences, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel. Every bit of support helps keep these forgotten stories alive, one legendary engine at a time.